Hi everybody, I'm Laura Forde. Thank you all for coming today. I'm going to speak about Jean-Luc Godard's first 15 films, which were remarkably made over the course of just 8 years. These films are rich cultural collages of art, literature, music, objects, and words. Godard's early films have been analyzed perhaps more than any other cinematic body of work, often through the lens of cultural theory, but not nearly enough attention has been paid to the critical role of designed objects in his films. The goal of my presentation today is to claim Godard's work as design, examining the ways in which he appropriates graphic power and meaning from designed objects like magazines, newspapers, posters, and books for his own expressive purposes. Godard, as most of you know, was a critic before he was a filmmaker, and perhaps this explains some of his fascination with the written word. One of Godard's primary methods of recording his thoughts on screen was the use of his own handwriting. In his early films, we occasionally observe characters writing, but it seems clear that the words being written are in fact the personal utterances of Godard himself, what Roland Barthes calls écriture. There are some precedents, of course, such as the work of artist and filmmaker Jean Cocteau, whose loopy, iconic handwritten signature leaves little doubt about who the author of the film really is. Cocteau wrote in his journals, "The cinema is still a form of graphic art. I write in pictures. I show what others tell." For Cocteau and Godard, handwriting is an inseparable part of their artistic and graphic identity, and the writing in the film is treated as an integral part of the formation of the image. In a scene near the end of 1965's Pierrot le Fou, we see what can only be Godard's pen, disconnected visually as it is from its character, turning the word art into the word death, which parallels the story but also suggests through its content, as well as its color, the life and the work of artist Yves Klein. Here's the Déclaration de Nouveau Realiste of 1960, signed by 9 artists, including Klein. And here, on the right, a pithy truism from the same year by Fluxus artist Ben Vautier, more commonly known simply as Ben. In a 1966 interview, Godard said, I buy certain papers solely to be able to read the advertisements. All of it interests me, how the slogans change, the graphics, the ways of seducing the consumer public. And Godard uses print media fanatically. Beginning with his first feature, Breathless, Godard employs dozens of newspapers to advance the plot, like this one here of the inspector in the center holding a newspaper. He also mines images of women from fashion magazines. Godard was, in his own words, obsessed with advertising, finding it to be a richer treasure trove of documentation than any archive. In a long scene from Une Femme Mariée, we observe the main character, Charlotte, as she looks at an Elle magazine from cover to cover. The relentless but carefully constructed scene reveals dozens of makeup and lingerie ads packed with messages about beauty, scandal, truth, and desire, exemplifying Godard's fear that people's existence is no more than a reflection of what they see, and that their freedom is merely prefabricated thought. Ironically, the art director of French Elle, Peter Canap, wrote in his recent monograph that the films of the French New Wave were the single biggest influence on his work. In 1962's Vivre sa vie, the main character, Nana, played by Anna Karina, starts out the film working in a record store, but does not earn enough money to pay her rent, and so she is evicted and ends up working as a prostitute. One of the film's most memorable images is of Nana standing against a wall of ragged posters, one of Godard's many not so subtle but nevertheless brilliant comparisons between advertising and prostitution. This image of Nana bears a strong resemblance to the 1959 advertisement for the French department store Galeries Lafayette, designed by Swiss graphic designer Jean Widmer. Widmer's thoughts could be Godard's when he says Galeries Lafayette invited their customers to indulge in a pictorial culture imbued with meaning. I sought to discover how to awaken consumer curiosity with a new sort of magazine and newspaper advertising. It's safe to say that Hollywood never set out to seduce a reading public, whereas maybe the French did. And this is just one of the marked differences between French and American films. Godard's characters read all the time, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently. They read in bed, or on the train, walking down the street, or in the bathtub. They read while driving in cars, or sitting in movie theaters. In Godard's films, reading is not simply relegated to nerdy intellectual types, although there are some, like these two, named after the Flaubert characters Bouvard and Pécuchet. But nerds aside, children also read. Here a couple of kids ask a clerk if he has anything sexier than Disney's Sleeping Beauty. Prostitutes read Ray Bradbury's A Medicine for Melancholy. Revolutionaries read, generally Mao, Marx, or Lenin. Even criminals read. Here's my favorite, Arthur in Bandapar, stealing a book in the middle of an armed robbery. For Godard, the plastic qualities of the written word are paramount. Book jackets are zoomed in on, and the found words function as intertitles, a kind of dialogue reminiscent of silent film. An early example of this can be found in 1961's Une femme est une femme, one of Godard's most romantic and playful films. A young couple, Angela and Emile, have a fight before going to bed, and refusing to speak, instead choose to hurl insults at each other using combinations of words found on book jackets. Angela pulls a book from the shelf, covers up part of the title with her hand, and holds it up, declaring Emile to be a monster. He responds with Ava, or Eve in English, a pulp thriller by British writer James Hadley Chase. Emile probably chose this book based on its subject matter rather than its graphic content, as Eve was a cold-hearted femme fatale. When he realizes Ava's title does not work as part of their wordplay, he hastily turns the book horizontally, adding with a pen to faire foutre, or making the meaning ostensibly, and go fuck yourself. Forgive the bad language. Several of the books featured in Emile and Angela's argument scene are from Gallimard's Série Noire, or Black Series. Launched in 1945, this collection of hard-boiled detective thrillers features mostly Anglophone authors like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. These memorable black paperbacks with their uniform yellow slab serif typography feature prominently into the history of the French New Wave, offering the directors fast-paced stories to remix and reinterpret. Another Gallimard imprint that figures prominently in Godard's films is the Idée collection, launched in 1962 and devoted to the social sciences. Designed by Gallimard's celebrated art director Massin, and together with photographer Henry Cohen, the covers were distinguished by their use of lowercase Helvetica titles knocked out of an abstract synthesized background, what Cohen called photographics. In 1967's Two or Three Things I Know About Her, Godard appropriates these book jackets as an ironic commentary on the story, which deals explicitly with the failings of modern life. He dispenses with the need to show people reading or holding a book, and instead just cuts to the word idée on screen several times throughout the film, followed by the book titles or fragments of book titles, such as Psychology of Form, Introduction to Ethnology, or The Classes, New Lessons on Industrial Society. When blown up on screen and cropped tightly by Godard, Cohen's photographics look more like abstract expressionist paintings, and what you are seeing is one of Godard's ready-made meta-titles. Well, Godard is not a practicing designer in the traditional sense. He was both an auteur, an author, and an amateur of design. And by amateur, I mean the French word meaning of lover of, rather than the more pejorative amateur. Not unlike the Dadaists and the Surrealists who preceded him, Godard is an autodidact whose obsession with graphic language influenced his own creative expression, resulting in a body of work of early films that have come to represent France in the 1960s, subsuming, and I would even argue, even outshining the contributions of his French-Swiss graphic design contemporaries. Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, it's the Mad Men 60s portion of today's events. You know, now that you say all this, I go, yeah, but it's really nothing I had thought of whenever I thought of Godard in the past. Has this been explored as an idea in his films?
You know, I don't think it has, and I've been having a lot of fun exploring it, although it's a deep topic.
Yeah. It's interesting. I wonder, I was thinking at the same time, certainly in early Godard, and basically at the heart of his early career in the 60s, there was, of course, a great golden heyday of highly graphic designed Hollywood credit title sequences. I mean, is there any connection, do you think, between those, or is this coming from an entirely different impulse?
I think it's coming from a different impulse. I've thought a lot about that. I feel like the Hollywood, the Saul Bass and the Pablo Ferro and the Bond titles that people are so familiar with, were almost like these little films within films.
Right.
And as much as I love them and how charming they are, Godard's graphics become kind of a text throughout the film, and he really integrates. And then what I wasn't able to cover is the way he creates many of his own titles that have kind of an amateurish quality, and almost in a way, to me, a slightly punk rockish quality. You know, the way he just inserts text up on the screen, kind of whenever he wants to comment.
Are they often, as they seem in your presentation, sort of little jokes and winks?
There's quite a bit of wordplay, yes. You wouldn't want to play bottle with Godard. He's somebody who finds words nested in other words, as like it seems to really delight him, and he uses it often.
The other, again, in the visual arts and fine art that coincided with this, and I thought of when you talked about his mimicking pastiche parody of fashion photography. I mean, the pop art, Lichtenstein, Warhol, and what he was doing in that, at least part of his art, seemed indeed to come out of some generally similar part of the zeitgeist. Yes?
I think that's true, yes.
Yeah.
And this nouveau realisme was sort of the French incarnation of pop art, which was predominantly a British and American phenomenon.
Right.
After the war, the French had kind of their own spin on it, and he was very influenced by those French artists. He doesn't actually talk about Warhol much, and I was surprised, because what he does, the way he uses the language of advertising and mass media in his films as a critique, I think is very similar to what Warhol did.
Well, and the way he also, certainly as a filmmaker, as filmmakers, as very different as they both are highly perverse and dare the audience to hate what they're watching.
That's true.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.